Hello everyone, I'm Nicola Winters, Head of International at Search Laboratory, and welcome to today's webinar on the top 5 international digital marketing fails. So very briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with who Search Laboratory are, we're an integrated global digital marketing agency of around about 150 people, and we're split in between offices, the UK and the US. So I guess in practical terms, that means that we can support clients at all stages of the online user journey. So that means that we can do SEO, PPC, programmatic advertising, social media, and digital strategy. I guess the unique thing about us is that we're able to do that globally by having an in-house team of native linguists. So a bit of housekeeping for you to start off with. The webinar should last around about 30 minutes, but if you do have any questions as we go along, please don't hesitate to send them through the chat box at the side of the screen, and I'll make sure to spend a few minutes at the end of this presentation just to answer these. So just to introduce myself a little bit further, I work from the UK office here in Leeds, and I directly manage the international team, who are an in-house team of native speakers who are digital marketers. So we operate in around about 30 languages and service clients in just over 18 countries. And I remember when I first started here that I thought, wow, what a unique setup. And actually now I just realise it's absolutely essential to be able to service all of our clients correctly and strategically. So we tend to be really proactive at understanding the cultural differences that can affect results online. Things like user behaviour, their preferences or expectations, their interest trends, and then any events that can really drive sales. So for the purposes of this webinar, I've separated the examples of fails into 5 key areas for international expansion. So I'll be looking at the biggest mistakes that brands tend to make within these, as well as going through some tips and advice that you can hopefully start to implement almost immediately. So we'll start off with market entry. This is all about being able to identify the markets that present the biggest opportunities for your brand and its products or services. Then we'll be looking at the localization of each website, but looking much further than simply a direct translation or copy and language. Then it's on to SEO, but to be more precise, this is about the technical SEOing of a site, making sure that as well as users, Google or a search engine is able to read your content too. We'll then move on to budget, which is arguably the most important, where we'll look at the problems associated with applying the same KPIs across all global sites. And then last but by no means least, we'll look at how to promote your website once you've launched in that market in order to send positive brand signals to a search engine. So without further ado, we'll start off with market entry. Now, in my role, we help lots of brands expand, and arguably, this is where my team spend the most of their time. It might be spent analysing or testing, and sometimes the sheer scale and size of this project just puts a lot of companies off doing it, so they kind of restrict themselves. Whereas others, I mean, as you can imagine, it's a very exciting time, and so they can get slightly carried away, which brings us on to our first fail, which is trying too much at once. Now, the problem with doing this in bulk is that it can be extremely hard to ensure that all sites are technically, linguistically, and culturally set up correctly for its users. Not only the users, but the search engines need to be able to relate to that content in the right context. So we often see brands launching multiple international sites at the same time. Sometimes it might be launching the same market, but just in a different language. And they're investing a lot of time and money into creating localized versions of all of these sites, expecting very similar results and fast. Now, without putting the right sort of marketing budget to promote that once it's live, unfortunately, just because you build that website, it doesn't necessarily mean that the customers will come. And it can also be really hard to track the performance or the success of the market entry when you don't look at this at country level. So choosing the most suitable domain for your overseas expansion is absolutely vital and should be one of the first steps that you take to international success. However, this is something that a lot of businesses struggle with, and kind of understanding those subtle differences and the impact that a domain has on a business can be quite confusing. So in terms of structuring your website, there's 3 main approaches that you could typically take, all of which have completely different cost implications, or short or even long-term benefits. So the first one is a CCTLD, which stands for Country Code Top Level Domain. The second is a subfolder approach, and the third is a subdomain approach. Some examples, as you can see on the screen, are from big brands such as Coca-Cola, Apple, and Wikipedia. And I guess the reason why I included these examples was to just explain that there is actually no right or wrong answer. It should all be dependent on your long-term goals, short-term goals, the resource available to you and your business. So some of the advantages and disadvantages associated with this, when looking at a CCTLD, which is the domain structure that Coca-Cola are using, this has a much stronger location signal to Google or whichever search engine. And because of that, it has a higher degree of a trust from a native user as well. They can see that it is made for them. Long term as well, it can have a really positive effect on your ranking potential. But of course, the disadvantages of this is, because the domain authority is self-contained, this takes time, resource, and money to build authority. So it can be quite costly to set this domain up from scratch. And the link authority would need to be built in from scratch too. With a subfolder, each subfolder benefits from the link authority by the top level domain. So this means it can actually be relatively cheap to set up multiple subfolders. The search engines recognize that you are targeting different places as well. But I guess the disadvantages associated with a subfolder is that even though search engines recognize that, users may not be able to see that location signal as closely, particularly of that of a CCTLD. Now, when you see a subdomain, which is the one that Wikipedia are using, this actually sits in between the other two in terms of pros and cons. It doesn't really have the full benefits of either, but similarly, it doesn't suffer from some of the restrictive drawbacks that some of them offer. So the decision about which domain structure to use should be made solely on, like I've said, resource, budget, and the original business objectives and analysis of the industry. However, at the end of each section, I wanted to end with a takeaway tip that you can start to implement immediately. So in order to give yourself the best chance of international dominance, I suggest to take a detailed look at the markets you wish to enter, fully analysing them before spending any serious budget. So the things that we need to look into are things like user behaviour, the competitor strength, and overall interest in your products or services. So my tip for ensuring that you have all the relevant data at your fingertips to be able to make this decision is to actually start by looking at your own site first. Look at the existing analytics of your main site. This is because it can be really dangerous to solely rely on third-party tools and data. So instead, start by asking yourself questions like, where are we getting traffic and conversions from at the moment? Which countries are already landing on our site? And what is the conversion rate? All of these types of metrics can indicate an interest and desire to engage with your brand, despite there not being already a localized version of that site. The next step is to conduct thorough competitor analysis as well. Find out the markets that your competition is already profiting from. So SEMrush is my personal favorite tool to look at for this, because you can also analyze the search interest, which is incredibly important. So it's essential to find out where there's the most search traffic potential for your company. And then last, and this is important, please make sure to conduct a full SERP analysis to simply check who is appearing in the SERPs and who's dominating that space, particularly those dominating page one. You know, the competition may vary. There might be local competitors within there. It might also be that the user or search intent differs across certain keywords. And I guess we need to ask ourselves the question, could we realistically compete in this market with the resources and the budget and the time available to us? So Mangle tools are another good resource for this. They have a free SERP checker. All of this can still be found in SEMrush, but there are just a few examples of the tools that you can use. Step 2 is to then generate more insight by building out test landing pages. So depending on the nature of the business, create a subfolder on your site and use paid ads to target users in a particular area. So this can be completely localized. And by running that paid ad campaign, you can start to collect your own raw data needed on the behavior of users in that market. So testing markets using this type of method means you're gathering as much data and insight as possible. and ultimately understanding your customers in that market before investing heavy amounts on localization projects or website translation projects. And it can also build the bones of a digital promotional strategy for future use. Sorry about that. So the team and I have helped lots of businesses expand their offering, particularly across Europe. And to be honest, every experience and strategy is completely different. So we make sure that it's bespoke to the needs, the goals, and the resources available to our clients at that time. So with Hootsuite, we built out a fully localized campaign for the European market. And once it went live, we regularly reviewed and optimized this account, adding more and more keywords to the account as we went along. So actually, we started out with around about 3,000 keywords, and this grew to 6,400, which is around about 120% account growth. Now, the key thing to remember here is that over half of the conversions came from keywords that we'd added over time. So not only does this allow us to make an informed decision on which markets are giving us the best ROI, but also this forms a foundation of our organic strategy as well, because now we're starting to understand the relevant keywords and longer tail phrasing that's associated with our products. So moving on to localization. Now, it wasn't that long ago actually that shamefully I used to refer to this part as the translation part. However, it's much more than simply looking at copy on the site and directly translating from one language to another. This is about delivering users an experience that makes them want to come back again and again to your site, which brings us to the second international marketing fail of today's webinar, and that's translation automation. Now, don't get me wrong, using automation within translation projects is extremely cost effective. But when it's done incorrectly, it can have really damaging effects. And that can lead to things like a brand's inability to realistically compete in any market. It can lead to poor rankings, low click-through rate, low conversion rates. But I guess ultimately it damages your brand identity, and it can be something that's really hard to claw back once it's happened. So when translation and SEO are carried out completely separately, it goes through a kind of review process before the translation memory is updated. So the translation memory is there to help with things like consistency in terms of messaging and terminology, as well as reduce costs for any repeated words in the future. So it's a very valuable tool. Yet the SEO optimizations, like anything from page titles, keyword usage, meta descriptions, headers, etc., they're all added once the page is live. So this means that whenever we need to make any changes or update to existing pages of our website, it means that the non-optimized text in the translation memory is reused. And of course, that is for consistency. But what it means that all SEO changes for optimization that were made in the past are now completely lost. So the key thing to remember here is that SEO changes must be fed back into the translation memory. This could either be as part of the review loop or by just feeding them in manually afterwards. So I guess the key to success for online visibility is actually when translation and SEO are done in a completely integrated way. So start with the keyword research and then use those target keywords and to be included in the page copy. Those keyword optimized copy, that keyword optimized copy is then added to the translation memory during that process. So everything is ready to be reused in the future. Now, unfortunately, the ideal process when launching a site is often overlooked, and I personally can't count the amount of times I've been faced with a client where I've had to tell them that actually hundreds of pages of their website needs re-optimizing before we can do any real promotion work. And sometimes that means that we're ultimately undoing all of the hard work that's undertaken by the translators who'd actually delivered exactly what they were asked for. So my tip here is whether launching a brand new site or simply just looking to translate a section of it, first put budget behind SEO. Start with the keyword research done by SEO professionals and mother tongue specialists or native speakers. Applying this to page level as well can allow you to build out almost a sitemap for those translators. So once we have that keyword research, we can start applying much more. Things like primary, secondary, and tertiary keywords for all of those pages. and looking at things like titles, localized URLs, headers, but also meta descriptions. Now, all of this informs the translators the type of audience they are creating for, where the audience is in the buying funnel for that page, what do they expect to find on the page, and much more, which actually speeds up the translation process. So step 2 is to build out almost like a glossary for your translators and keep it, build on it, use it for other launches as a starting point. I mean, alternatively, you can use this type of document to build out content strategies for blogs and content hubs for the future. So by getting this right at the beginning, you are giving yourself the right sort of chance of building trust with the audience you are targeting, but you're also seeing a quicker return on that investment. You're getting more people converting and revisiting your site, as well as saving money in the long run. So we ensure that when working on a full website translation project with our clients, that we always deliver a market-ready website. So for MERLIN Cycles, we helped them launch in Japan, and we provided page-level keyword research, glossaries, data on the search and user intent, but then we even used this data and insight to build a localized PPC ad campaign that would target their head terms. That means that before this site was even launched, a full promotion plan bespoke to that Japanese market had been created. So moving on now to SEO, because let's imagine that you've done all of that hard work, you've spent time testing the markets, and you've got your site localized. We now need to provide Google with the relevant information so that it can rank the correct pages and content in the right markets and languages. Now, hreflang is a HTML tag that you can add directly to the source code of a page, and it indicates to a search engine the language of the content and also whether there are any alternative versions of other languages or specific locations. So the main purpose is to help search engines understand the language of a piece of content and therefore can help to serve it to the correct users in that market. It's essentially a simple piece of code, but it's the one thing that developers keep getting wrong, and a small error can have a massive impact, which brings us on to this fail. So without the correct implementation of hreflang, search engines may rank incorrect content for the market. Even worse, it might choose not to rank any of the content at all, simply because it can't decide which one's the right one to do. Not only does this stop your content that you've spent all that time on getting in front of the right people, it also creates duplicate content on site. And we all know that that's something which Google does not favour. I guess the overall result is lower organic search visibility and potentially putting that site at risk of a Panda algorithm, which was always designed to target duplicate content. So hreflang is relevant in two scenarios. The first being where we have multiple pages offering the same thing in the same language, but it's regional content. So on the screen now we have an example that is for the UK, for Ireland, for Australia, and for the US. The other scenario is where we have translated copy in different languages, so it needs to appear when people are searching from a particular location. So we need to provide Google with this information through the hreflang code. And this is how the code breaks down. So first of all, we are telling Google there are alternative versions of this piece of content. We then give them the location of these alternative versions. We tell them the language, and then we tell it, finally, which country location it's relevant for. So a few common mistakes that happen within hreflang tags. One that we see happening quite a lot is the misuse or errors within ISO codes. So ISO codes are used to tell search engines which country the page is targeting and which language the user needs the content to appear in. The ISO codes need to be structured language first and then country. Mixing the order is a common mistake. One thing that we see quite a lot is people being confused by GB, UK, and EN. And so another example here is that Europe is not a recognised ISO region or country, so it can't be targeted with hreflang. Another mistake is when we see people combining canonical and hreflang tags. So canonical tags are used to show a search engine which page should be indexed as the master page and which pages are alternative versions and should not be indexed. Whereas hreflang tags show which page is the main page but does not block the indexing of the alternative versions. Multilingual sites need to ensure that they are using self-referential canonical tags when combining with hreflangs. This is just to ensure that search engines can easily crawl and index all variations of that page. So once hreflang has been correctly set up, it's important that you set up the right analytics to track that. So we commonly see brands setting up analytics to track traffic overall to that site. However, the correct use of hreflang tags is likely to cause an initial drop in the overall site traffic. And this is simply because users are sent to the correct localized versions of their relevant site. Instead, a tip here is to measure things like your click-through rate, your conversion rate, and your overall visibility and rankings within that market once you've implemented hreflang. And what a difference it makes. This example here is taken from one of our fashion brands, Outnet, and it shows us that their visibility was, it was pretty steady, but the tech team here at Search Laboratory, they quickly identified that there were errors that had been made in the hreflang code. And what that meant was that certain pages that were designed for the US were actually ranking in the UK and vice versa. And once this was fixed by the tech team, visibility increased dramatically. And as you can see, it remained stable as well, meaning they were receiving more relevant customers and ultimately increasing their profit. So a little bonus tip for you here with hreflang. It's actually important to place the hreflang code as close to the head of the page as possible. And this is just so that the search engine bots are able to read and crawl that link and understand how the pages all correlate with each other. So if putting the tags first thing isn't possible, just try and avoid placing them under any complex scripts that take time to load. So these scripts can affect like the crawlability of a site and mean that hreflang alternative pages can't be discovered. This example was taken from one of our clients, and the hreflang tag was actually underneath this complex script. And after we removed that script and placed the hreflang tag towards the head of the page, the hreflang tags were then discovered by Google. So moving on to spend now. This is all about the way that budget is distributed across markets on a digital scale. Now, unfortunately, this is slightly related to the market entry fail about trying too much at once, but what we see too often is companies spending a little bit here and a little bit there, and yet they're having massive teams behind the parent site, whether that be the US or the UK. Spreading budget too thinly is the fourth fail on the list today. Not performing gap analysis at market level means that you end up applying the same KPIs across all sites and ultimately tracking overall performance. So the problem with applying the same KPIs globally is that it can be much cheaper to retarget customers if you are already aware of your customer base and your existing customers. However, whenever entering a new market, it takes time and budget to establish things like brand awareness, trust in your audience, and then ultimately affect conversions. So it's really important to research the market. For example, is there another search engine that is being used quite often? What's the algorithm like? How does that function? Are there any differences in seasonality and sales, for example? Is there any key sales events that kind of drive sales in a particular area but not others? So, for example, Black Friday is not widely adopted globally. Another place to look is marketplaces and resellers. So this could be the likes of Amazon, but also the popularity of those marketplaces may vary quite a lot globally. And the second is just general competition in those markets. So just focusing on the marketplaces example, looking at Amazon in isolation, which is one of the sort of US giants when it comes to e-commerce platforms. We know through our experience that a lot of people who use Amazon, 92% of people who start there will eventually buy on Amazon. And this sheer volume of visitors per month from the UK and the US means that it's an absolute giant. But when we look globally, the popularity varies massively. So although Amazon is still dominant in India, Flipkart, which is a competitor of theirs, continues to hold the market share. When we look at China as well, Amazon isn't anywhere to be seen in the big players. And actually, they failed to invest initially in entering China as a market. And that's because Alibaba and lately JD.com have been controlling more than 80% of their e-commerce market. Amazon re-entered about 2 years later as a seller on Tmall, which is kind of unthinkable as we know Amazon right now. But I guess what I'm trying to say is what Amazon did was eventually they exploited a gap that China had in its market. And they saw an opportunity to provide cross-border e-commerce for Chinese customers, and they used merchants from their US, UK, and Japanese marketplaces. So a bit of an obvious one here, but it's all about exploiting the gaps competitors and markets are leaving. As mentioned before, that take time to really understand the algorithm of the different search engines if that's applicable for the market that you're entering. Yandex, for example, is the biggest search engine that is used in Russia. They took out links out of their algorithm back in 2015, only to then put them back in a year later. We also know that the algorithm doesn't mind too much about domain structure. It will rank .coms no problem. And we also know, through our own experience of working with our client base, that it's not unusual for Russians to buy from English sites. Baidu, which is a search engine used in mainland China for simplified Chinese, uses a completely different set of criteria. So just looking at Baidu in isolation for China, 80% of the SERP is actually dominated by paid ads. And we know from our experience of working in the Chinese market that Chinese people trust these paid ads. It's seen as marketing done well. And ultimately what that means is that the click-through rate for any organic listings remains really low. So not just your search engines, think where your customers are as well. Understand where they are in terms of how do they consume their news, what social media platforms are they on, and how do they engage with their brands. So we should all be familiar with the social media icons here on the right, but how familiar are we with WeChat, for example? And this is the social media platform used in China, and it has a feature on there called WePay, and that is used by 80% of the Chinese population for online purchases, so it can't be ignored. So now when looking at your own international domain, it's vital to build on the awareness of your brand. So despite the fact that you might be using marketplaces to generate sales, it might be that you're using paid advertising as well, but the search engines, in particular Google, needs to see a constant influx of positive brand signals to be able to rank you accordingly. And in a digital world, one of the easiest ways to measure brand awareness is in your search visibility. Do you appear for the relevant terms? Which brings us to the final fail, assuming brand awareness. So just because you were receiving conversions from the market or were pleasantly surprised by an initial paid advertising campaign, this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to receive similar results on an organic scale. And why would you want to keep paying for that traffic? And I remember a while ago now, there was a headline about Google's Vince's update, and it was about sort of big brand rankings. And there was a headline that says, Google calls it a trust change. And this still gets talked about in the industry even to this day. But I just wanted to highlight that that headline was back in 2009. Brand is nothing new. The concept of brand has been spoken about in the SEO community for almost 10 years now. And just looking at Google's guidelines, the word trust is mentioned 69 times in the quality rater guidelines, which kind of says it all. So we know that big brands ooze trust signals, and we work with them on things like content marketing, digital PR, on-site content, and working with influencers to ensure that we generate lots of high-quality links and online mentions, also to generate regular press coverage as well. Large social media followings are important, but what search engines and Google in particular wants to see is strong branded search volume. This could go even more granular to look at on-site documentation. So this could be anything from privacy policy, terms and conditions, cookie policies, anything like that. So there's no real tip for this one. The decisions need to be completely bespoke for each brand, and obviously it will always be dependent on the industry that you're operating within. But here at Search Laboratory, we've created an extensive list of actions for brands to take when either entering a new market or migrating from one site to another. So these are all the things that help Google to understand how trustworthy a brand is by ensuring a constant flow of positive signals. These are all associated with expertise, authoritativeness, and trust, hence EAT checklist. So these are broken down into sections that can be implemented either site-wide or on product and category pages, and then more about your creative, informative content, such as blogs and content hubs, etc. Cue Star Wars. So when working on promotional content, we helped a stationery client, and we looked at their product Post-it notes. So in the UK, you can imagine we're up against quite a lot of big competitors. Postitnotes.com, we were up against Amazon and the works. And what we needed to do was come up with a creative campaign that would allow lots of press coverage, lots of social media following, and lots of links as well across Europe, but more importantly, that would cause a strong branded search volume as well. And so we created Star Wars Post-it murals. And as you can see from the SERPs here, what the effect had in the UK was, even though we only increased our rankings 4 positions, that was huge in terms of revenue, visibility, and conversions, because we then were ranking above the likes of Amazon and the works. The key thing to remember here as well is that whilst we were sending positive brand signals to Google, we also increased our rankings, which is an SEO metric. We chose where we wanted to promote it as well, and we left out certain markets where we would not have seen that return. So just to summarise everything that I have spoke about today, when it comes to market entry, don't try too much at once. Instead, focus and gather as much raw data as you can. When it comes to localization, think more than simply direct translations. With hreflang, make sure it's set up correctly, free from errors, and don't spread budget too thinly. Please don't assume brand awareness. So just to summarize, build out test landing pages and use paid ads to test markets before investing in any localization or translation projects. Conduct thorough keyword research by native speakers and apply that at page level, building out glossaries for your translators to work from. With SEO, make sure that the hreflang tag in the head section of the source code is correct, free of errors, and that will help Google to serve the correct content to users based on their language and/or location. Perform gap analysis in each market as well and apply specific KPIs to campaigns, always based on resource, opportunity, and the time available. And with brand promotion, improve your Google's EAT rating by ensuring a constant influx of positive signals, all associated with expertise, authoritativeness, and trust. That brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much for listening. If you do have any questions, we do have time to take a few more. I have a few already that I'm just going to go through. So the first question is, I am already in the process of translating my site. Is it too late to think of SEO now? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So as I mentioned in the second section on localization, it's all about making sure that SEO can be part of the review loop. So as long as the optimized text goes into that translation memory, all future updates will be protected. So if you are halfway through a translation project, then don't hesitate to get in touch with SEO professionals. I have another question here. So, are there any tools you would recommend using to decide on which market to enter next? Yes, I've got loads, to be honest. I mentioned a few. SEMrush is one of my personal favorites. However, Google also offers quite a lot of free tools. One of them being the Google Market Finder and a Global Market Finder. And that's a free tool where you can put your existing URL of your current site. It will automatically pull any categories that it believes is irrelevant. You can decide to add more categories if you wish, and it will spill out the 3 markets that pose the biggest opportunity. And this is based on metrics like the online population, disposable income, the cost per click, and the search interest, the search volume around your products. Yes, they can give you a little bit of insight, but to be honest, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to generate your own data, do your own testing, and kind of only use these third-party tools as a little bit of a snapshot. But yes, definitely test and try and get your own data yourselves. If there are any other questions, I will make sure to catch up individually and answer those. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to speak to you soon.